I am myself Dr. Avinash Trivedi, Professor in Department of Computer Science and Engineering, JIMS, Greater Noida. Today we will discuss about one very important topic of Java, that is Java Constructor. And these are some topics which we will cover. So if we talk about what is Java Constructor, see Java Constructor is a special method that is called when an object is instantiated. And we know how to instantiate any variable. We write class name, then the name of object which we want to give, then equal sign, then we use new keyword, and then class name along with bracket. And my class along with bracket is known as constructor. And this is default constructor. And a new word is used to create a space in memory. So what is syntax here? Syntax is first you write class name, then you give object name equal new, and then constructor name. And a Java class constructor initializes instances of that class. What is meaning of this? We know objects are physical things and classes are logical things. And physical things exactly exist. And when we create object, then every object takes some space in memory, and its members are instance variable and method. To initialize instance variable, we use constructors. Java constructors can also take parameters, so fields can be initialized in the object creation time. What is meaning? There are two ways. One is no argument parameter, that is default parameter, means constructor. In default constructor, objects are initialized with its default values. But when we use parametric constructor, then we can initialize instance variables at the time of object creation. Defining a constructor in class, how do we define it? As we know, class name and constructor name both are same. And as we know, constructor is like a method, and it has access modifier along with class name, and in class name it should be similar. And as we know, to create constructor, you have options whether you are trying to create a constructor without parameter or with parameter. So these are some points related to Java constructor. It is a special type of method which is used to initialize the object. Yes, very true. It is a like method, and all the instance variables are initialized using this constructor. Every time an object is created using the new keyword, at least one constructor is called. When you are using class name space object name equal new, then constructor, then at least one constructor will be called, and that constructor will either initialize with default values or the value which you are passing at the time of object creation. It calls a default constructor if there is no constructor, and it is up to you whether you are mentioning object name along with constructor or not. If you are calling constructor, then if there is defined constructor, then that will be called, Otherwise, your JVM will include default constructor. There are two types of constructors in Java: no argument constructor and parameterized constructor. Means either you are not passing any value in constructor, or you can pass values in constructor. It calls a default constructor if there is no constructor available in the class. In such case, Java compiler provides a default constructor by default. Obviously, no object in this world comes without the constructor. Mother fathers are also our constructors. Similarly, every object has been created or will be created with the help of constructor. If you are not mentioning any constructor, you are not defining, then by default compiler will provide you a constructor to create and to initialize an object. It is called constructor because it constructs the value at the time of object's creation. It is not necessary to write a constructor for a class. It is because Java compiler creates a default constructor if your class does not have any. It means it is up to we what constructor we are using. If we are not mentioning, then compiler will provide default constructor. If we have written any constructor in the program, then that will be called, and we will mention it at the time of object creation. Rules for creating Java constructor. There are two rules defined for the constructor. What are those? Constructor name must be same as its class name. It is mandatory condition. Suppose class name is a student, then your constructor name will also be student. A constructor must have no explicit return type. We will not mention its return type. Constructor name must be same, and there should not be any return type. A Java constructor cannot be abstract, static, final, and synchronized. So these are some words which, when placed, have some meaning. So we are not using these words before any constructor. But we can use access modifier while declaring a constructor. It controls the object creation. It means your access modifiers like default, private, public, protected are used in constructor based upon our requirement. Types of Java constructors. There are basically two types of constructor. One is default constructor when we are not passing any argument, and the second one is parameterized constructor when you are passing values, and that will initialize instance variable at the time of object creation. And what is syntax of writing default constructor? In this, we are writing class name, then bracket, and body of constructor. In this, we can see the example of default constructor. There is one class a bike1, and in class there is one constructor, and in this constructor we have not initialized any variable, but there is one statement, that is system.out.println bike is created. So in this constructor there is only one statement, and it is not having any value. And where we are creating object, we are creating object in line bike1 b equal new bike1 bracket. This is calling a constructor, and one object b will be created in this statement, and while creating this object it will call bike1 constructor. And what is written in bike1 constructor? Bike is created. So output of this program will be bike is created. So in this program we have used one default constructor. Automatic creation of constructor. Suppose we have not mentioned any constructor in our program. Say there is one class, say bike, and it is not mentioning any constructor. Then compiler by default add one constructor in this program, and that will be default constructor, and the value which will be given to instance variable as default values. See, in this program there is one class, a student 3, and it has two instance variables. One is id and second one is name, and this contains one method. And what is printing this method? This method is printing name and id, and program starts with a main method, and in main method we are creating two objects, student s1 and student s2. So we are creating two objects, and we are simply writing default constructor, that is student 3 bracket student 3 bracket, and then we are calling display method with the help of s1 and s2 object. What we see default values, that is 0 and null. So both the objects are initialized with its default values, and for integer default value is 0, and for string default value is null. So we are creating two objects with the help of default constructor, and default constructor is initializing with default values. Now we will talk about Java parameterized constructor. In this kind of constructor, we pass some values, and that value will be helping in initializing instance variable. And when we are using parameterized constructor, then we will have to create constructor in our program. So in this program we can see there is one class, that is student 4, and it has two instance variable, id and name, and as class name is student 4, and we are creating one parameterized constructor. It has also the same name, and there are two arguments we are mentioning here, means integer I and string n. So two instance variable and two variables are waiting for receiving values. One is of integer type and second one is of string type. So there are two parameters which we can pass. And what this constructor is doing? This constructor is initializing two instance variable. So what is mentioned in this program? Every object will contain two instance variables. One will be its id and second one is its name. And one constructor is mentioned that is used simply to initialize instance variable. And this class has one method, that is display method, which is displaying id and name of object. And again there is one main method, and what we are doing in main method, we are creating two objects, s1 and s2. And how we are using constructor? In constructor we are passing two arguments, one is id and second one is name. So once this S1 and S2 objects will be created, then it calls student constructor, a student for constructor. And once it is passing values, so at the time of object creation, it will initialize instance variables, and now objects are with initialization value. So when we call display method with the help of objects, we can see output of two objects instance values. Now, constructor overloading in Java. As we know, if number of parameters are same or different, but names of constructors are same, then based upon our requirement, that constructor is called. So how overloading concept comes in programming? If method names are same and parameters are different, then based upon number of parameters and types, that method is called, is known as method overloading. Similarly, if there are many constructors in any program, and based upon the type and number of parameters, if any constructor is called, then we say this process as constructor overloading. So in any class, uh, there may be one or more than that constructor, and based upon the calling, it calls constructor. So we say this as constructor overloading. We will understand constructor overloading with the help of one program. In this program, there is one class, say student 5. It has two variables, name and age, and one constructor name is given, and it is initializing these two instance variables, and there is second constructor also. It has all three parameters like id, name, as well as age, and it is initializing all three values of class, that is id, name and age. And there is display method which is displaying id, name and age. So there is one main method, and main method is creating two objects, object s1 and object s2. Now in first object creation, we are mentioning class name and passing only two values. It means we are passing only two arguments. And in creating s2 argument, we are passing three values. So first object creation will call constructor which has two parameters, and s2 will call the constructor which has three parameters. And when we call display method, then first object will show 111 Karan and 0, and second one is called 222 Aryan 25. Why there is 0 and why there is 25? Because once we have called means constructor with two parameter, then third variable is being initialized with its default value, that is 0. So in this program, we can see that there are many constructors in the program, and based upon the object creation, we can call any of these two constructors. So this is known as constructor overloading. Difference between constructor and method in Java. As the body is very similar in both the cases, Java constructor and Java method. And we will talk about the differences. A constructor is used to initialize the state of an object. So what are states? States are instance variable. So to initialize instance variable, we use Java constructor. And a method is used to expose the behavior of an object. Like means object can perform anything. Then that is variable. Like if there is a plumber has ability to fix problems of taps and pipes. Similarly, a student is studying any subject. So studying is a behavior, and we can compare that as a method. A constructor must not have a return type, but method must have a return type. Means either that is void or integer or any other return type is required in method, but not in constructor. The constructor is invoked implicitly, and I mean while creating your object, it is called implicitly, and method you will have to call explicitly. And how do we call this? With the help of object dot method name. The Java compiler provides a default constructor if you don't have any constructor in a class. Means every object must have initial values. If you are not mentioning any constructor in your program, then compiler will provide default constructor to that object. But method is must for calling and for using any task or completing any task. So method you need to mention. The constructor name must be same as the class name. Obviously, without that you will not be able to create object. But method name is not same as class name. Copy constructor. See, in C++, we use copy constructor to copy the value of one object into another one. And in Java, how this happens? This happens with the help of constructor by assigning a values of a one object into another by clone method of object class. So in this example, we can see how we are completing the task of copy constructor. There's one class, say student 6, and it has two variables, say ID and name. And there is one constructor with the same name, and this constructor is parameterized constructor, and it is initializing two variables. One is ID and second one is name. And in second constructor, we are mentioning means parameters are object, and it is of type student 6, and it is also initializing two variables, instance variable ID and name, with the help of object. So in this program we can see we are creating two objects, and one object is using one constructor and which is initializing variables. So in first constructor S1, what we are doing, we are calling constructor by passing two values. One is ID and second one is name. And when we are using or creating second object S2, then we are using the second constructor, and in this constructor we are passing object S1, and we are calling display method with the help of S1 object and S2 object. What we can see here, we are watching its value. So we are copying these two means value of one object to another one. There's one mistake in output, but exactly what happens, it will use the same values because we are copying the instance variable values of one object into another one. In this case, also we are using one constructor, and in second constructor, that is blank. I mean, we are not giving any body to this constructor, and we are mentioning one method. And what we are doing here, we are creating two objects s1 and s2. And how do we initialize instance variable of s2 object? And we are simply writing s2 dot its instance variable equal already created instance, that is s1, and its value. So whatever value object s1 will contain in its variables will be helping in initializing variables instance variable of s2 objects. So all the two instance variable of s2 object will be used here, and we can see result. In this case also, this results will be same. Whatever object s1 is having values, same value will be in second one. So thank you. In this lecture we have discussed about constructor, how constructors are helpful in our programming, and how do we use it while initializing instance variable of objects. And there are two types of constructors. One is no argument constructor, and second one is parameterized constructor. And constructor overloading is also possible, and if there is no constructor defined by the programmer, then compiler itself provide constructor, that is default constructor. Thank you.